I want to talk about a broader theme about the country and then weave it into an economic argument given the audience, and which is positive for all sides. And I'm glad to be here. I'm not a member of the PhD chamber, but I have worked with some of your members. I see some of them in this room. I run a private equity fund. We invest in mid-sized companies in India. And it is my view that if there is to be an economic revival, a long-term economic revival in India, it is at the hands of the mid-sized companies. We have reviewed mid-sized companies across the world, in India, in China, in the US. We ran a comparative analysis. Indian companies, mid-sized companies, are under-levered and perform at higher ROE than companies around the world, right? Under more strenuous conditions, as we all know, and perform heroically at times. So it is my view that this is a great audience to have this conversation with. Before I go into my thesis, I just want to respond to a question of Mr. Pava. May I?
Pava.
Mr. Pava, yes, may I?
Please do.
Yes. I think, Mr. Pava, you mentioned, sir, about the deteriorating microeconomic conditions over the last few years. And that is, of course, true. You see, we all pick up the same pink papers in the morning, and they are simply evidences of what is happening. But the diagnosis is different, right? There is very little investment capacity. There has been very little investment capacity in the Indian economy for the last few years. And that is the origin of the entire circle of problems that we are seeing in the microeconomy. The investment capacity got eroded on account of the excessive and perhaps over-exuberant lending during the UPA 10 years, especially during UPA 2, the results of which we are all seeing right now, which the IBC is attempting to correct. So even irrespective of which party comes back next time, it will not be an easy road to recovery, because the microeconomics of the entire country right now and the balance sheet of the country takes a while to fix. And NDA and Mr. Jaitley have done a heroic job, in my view, in the last 5 years in trying to consolidate the fiscal deficit. The single largest achievement of the previous regime, when it is recorded in time, will be fiscal consolidation at the center level, which has come down from 6.5% to 3.5%, which is enormous. It is like, taking the drugs away from a drug dealer. It is an impossible task. I mean, what do politicians love to do? Is they spend, because spending is power. For politicians to voluntarily give up that ammunition is an incredible thing. And it could not have happened under the hands of anybody else in the UPA, right? So I think we have to recognize that level of reform. And notwithstanding that, the IBC, the introduction of the IBC, despite its problems, is going to transform the language of Indian business. And you, as mid-sized companies, are probably seeing that, some for the positive, some for the negative, and that's how the coin lands. But it is a fact that it was long in need, and it is a positive development for the country. I'll just move away from that. I just thought I would respond to that brilliant question. So my argument is, it is a delicate argument, which is that the old is dying, but the new is yet not born in India. And out of that complexity, we are facing a lot of problems. And what is emerging is that, and when you see, and when you see a campaign, as we have just seen, that is so vicious. And
just take a minute. We're ordering a fresh round of tea, please. Yeah, because I think we respect the fact that yes, everyone's getting into the mood for a little bit of tea and a little bit of discussion. No,
So, and Rajiv, please stop me whenever you think it's...
no, please go ahead and...
Yeah. So, when you see the news, you see the viciousness, you see the cacophony, you see the noise, right? But what is happening in the country right now? It is only when the stakes get higher does the battle get more intense, right? So it is my view that an ideological battle is being fought in India, right, on three of the most critical issues that confront India today. Those issues are cultural identity, a national security, and economic policy. On all of these three aspects, the messaging of the BJP and the Congress could not be more different, right? And rarely has the position of these two parties been that much clearer and more stark, and the stakes so high. And why is that? This conflict has become sharper because of a reality which has been best recognized, I think, by one gentleman in the party, in the BJP. I think Mr. Agarwal would speak to that if he wishes, is Mr. Jaitley. And he has understood and spoken about how poverty in India is declining rapidly. In the last 5 years, more people have come out of poverty than in the history of contemporary India, right? Now, what happens when the poor come out of poverty? They enter the lower middle classes, right? And then gradually, hopefully, they go higher. But at that point of the convergence of India's political economy and the evolution of this economy and the shifting demographics lies a young, aspirational middle class whose origins lie in small town India, in the countryside, and not in urban India. So this population of subaltern origin, as I call it, is rising, and it is going to be, within the next 10 years, 1 billion people in size, right? Now just pause and consider the numbers. Like 1 billion people, by 10 years, 10 to 11 years, at the rate of growth of the economy, India will be about a $9 to $11 trillion economy, where the per capita income will be in about $6,000 to $7,000, $7,500, right? That's a middle income country, right? That's Vietnam, as in more than Vietnam right now. A billion consumers consuming with that ferocity, right, is a locomotive not only of India, it is a locomotive of growth for the world. It is what the US middle class has been for the entire world for the last 100 years, and what the Chinese middle class is becoming now, right? So in 10 years, we should all be, and you should all be, preparing for a country with 1 billion consumers at $6,000 to $8,000 per capita, right? This is not PPP. These are actual dollar numbers, like in hard numbers, right? Yeah. So this is a this is a nuanced argument. You have to stay with this, and it'll all come together in the end. Now, this is not unusual. Other countries have gone through this trajectory. The U.S. did it after the Civil War, right? From 1865 till 1920. All the bond issuances of the London Stock Exchange, about 80% of the bond issuances of London Stock Exchange, were to finance the growth of infrastructure in the U.S. The U.S. highways, the U.S. rail, the transcontinental rail lines, everything was financed out of long-term bond issuances coming out of London, right? What does that mean for India? It means that India cannot grow to become a $10 trillion economy and then eventually 20 trillion until it develops a corporate bond market that is deep, that is liquid, that is international. It is not just the DFIs. that we have spoken about. It is the creation of a healthy bond market. Banks and DFIs do a terrible job of financing infrastructure, right? The evidence is everywhere, right? We've already seen the crumbling infrastructure, the crumbling edifices of all the DFIs in the past. I don't think we should be looking at reviving any. Anyways.
You'll have to tell us what is DFI.
Or the development financial institution, like the domestic, so like the IFCIs of the world, right? But all of that aside, here's a socioeconomic point, which the BJP will cherish, right? As has happened for all these countries, Japan in the 1850s after it opened, the US after 1865, China in the 1980s, these young lower middle class populations, as they grow, they develop right-of-center political positions similar to the BJP's on all of these three core issues. Right? This is a population, therefore, that is socially conservative and economically liberal. Right? As such, the key question, therefore, is who will address the hopes and fears of this new India, as I call it? This new India, which is comprised of 1 billion people that you will not recognize, right? Your old drivers and your old maids and your servants and people coming out of the construction working industry and the agricultural people coming out of small towns, becoming the lower middle class, gradually the middle class. We'll have no memory of important Indian dates like 1947, like 1975, 2002, 1984, all these dates will mean nothing. There will be a young population. All right? And they will have very little affinity with Nehru's vision of an anglicized soft state or of Indira Gandhi's administrative state. Now, this is an important point. People don't realize, right? And people in this room should know. Let me ask you a question, right? Which city, forget the country. Okay, let me step back. For the last 2,500 years, two countries were 60% of the world GDP, right? Except for the last 200 years. The answer is obvious, China and India, right? Now, within India, who can tell me which was the city that had the largest GDP for 1,000 of those 2,000 years? Right? Anybody?
What was the question? Could you repeat that?
Which city
For
Which
1,000 years had the highest GDP in India
Which city?
out of the 2,000 years where GDP, 60% of the world GDP was basically from China and India? Which city in India had the highest GDP for 1,000 of those 2,000 years?
Varanasi?
You see, all these cities, we have forgotten our history, you see. Because we are still learning, we have not yet remembered that our history was written after 1947 by a narrow urban elite who negotiated power behind closed doors with the British to get into power and then wrote the history books. Kanpur was a military cantonment, did not exist. It was Kanpur, right? Bombay, Calcutta, these are cities that arose after the British created residencies over there, right? It is Ahmedabad, right? For 1,000 years, traders from Surat could go unmolested from Surat all the way to Antwerp, all the way to Amsterdam, carrying not a single rupee or whatever the currency was over time, right? But having an elaborate system of intermediaries every 200 miles, 100 miles, where they could exchange currencies, where accounts could be kept, they could be conveyed forward and backward, right? For 1,000 years, right? Right. And this is a system, and I never knew about it until I read Braudel. Fernand Braudel wrote about this when he talks about the commerce in Europe in 1950s. So, I have a strange interest in history. So, but all of this comes together. The point I'm making is, India is not and has never been a quote-unquote socialist country. It has never been an economy run by the government, or even an economy where the government has had a meaningful role, unless the members of the PhD chamber recognize their own origins of 100 generations, for which your ancestors were, and our ancestors were, the largest entrepreneurs of the world. How do you think the vast temples got built and financed in India, if not from the profits of trading regimes for 1,000 years? Out of the agricultural surpluses that were coming out of the most fertile riverside civilization that the world had ever seen. We were 28-30% of the world GDP for 2,000 years. Right? That is why you have an economy that was rich. The point I'm making is this, that this administrative state, I'm coming back to now, what Indira Gandhi created does not represent and has never represented who we are as an economy. So please stop looking to the government as any sort of salvation or as any sort of problem solver. The government has been and always is, I won't say this with Gopal sitting next to me, but in Reagan's terms, the government is the problem, it is not the solution. Right?
I think that's something which the PhD chamber is fairly unanimous.
And I say the government with a capital G, right? This is this is not a B.
But then you want the government to intervene in everything.
Okay.
No. Actually, this is a matter
Bail out
of... No, sir. This is a matter of his...
We are one chamber which does not complain.
No, which we never complain.
We suggest solutions.
The Ministry of Finance has always said that whenever they have called the PhD chamber, they have neither asked for concessions, tax concessions, they have never asked for exemptions. They have only pointed out problems and solutions. Sir, one thing which I can add to him, since both of you are economists, so are here, and I am a student of history. Actually, this problem of the administrative state has risen for the last 800 years. Because the moment we had alien rulers, the state became the deciding factor. Whereas earlier it was the Indian republics or kingdoms. I think the only thing which went wrong was that, unfortunately, we should recognize the service class, unfortunately, was declared by the Brahminical class as the lowest. The trading class came third. The unproductive became the 1 and 2. I think that is the big change which is taking place in India. Today it's a service economy, service sector economy which is accounting for it. Today what you are asking and what PhD chamber is asking and all the chambers are asking, that the productive classes are the ones which should come. That's what I think the eventual analysis will be, that whether it is production of services or whether it is production of goods and trade, those will come into focus.
This is the conversation we should be having over whiskey.
Not a bad idea.
Next meeting. What is the administrative state? Okay, it is a nomenclature which, in my view, I've created this. I mean, it exists, but it is my nomenclature for the state-owned economy that was born out of Indira Gandhi's paranoia, right? And who twisted Nehru's very limited socialist experiments to suit her own political needs. You see, her nationalization of the banks were not designed to serve any economic purpose. They were a political grab to eliminate the campaign financing power of the opposition and the patrons of the opposition, right? Very simple things. She nationalized the banks, accelerated the creation of the PSUs, and licensed private industry. Quick number. In 1950, how many PSUs were there after 3 years of Indian independence? 4. In 1971, there were 220, right? And all of those got created within Indira Gandhi's creation. So the point I'm making is that there is a friction between just the creation of the economy. But now I'll just come back to the thesis of India. As to what am I saying? This young population that comes out of these small towns, right? They'll start with clamoring for economic freedom and a market-based economy because they have no allegiance to the state economy, they have no remembrance of, right? And they will demand it as the only organizing principle that can deliver them jobs and wealth, right? And they will claim India's historical role in the world economy, A, B, culture, and C, civilization, right? And that is where, again, my point is, that, the BJP stands to gain. The evidence, I mean, if you ask, this is not just hypotheses, well, they are, but, I mean, where is the evidence on this, right? You can see the evidence on what is happening in China right now, next door, which is the only other civilization as nation. I mean, it is less a nation, more a civilization. Same for India. We're a country, but we're also a civilization. We're a people. The rise of a young, proud, and nationalist middle class in China has not followed the trajectory of them demanding greater social freedoms as was expected, right? 10 years ago, what is the reason for the friction between China and US right now, right? Because the US, when Clinton allowed China to enter the WTO, the premise was that it is only when China becomes affluent and the middle class is created, then they will demand political freedoms in the same way that Westerners have for 200 years. Right? That was the premise. That was proven false. When Chinese middle class emerged, they became increasingly socially conservative and are very willing to adhere to the party line out of Beijing. We have 3 joint ventures in China. I travel there every quarter. Right? They're sharp, intellectually able, and superb people, but it is never going to become an individualistic society in the way that the Western freedom and the Western politicians had thought it would, right? That is the point. That new Indian subaltern middle class will also seek to define modernity, not along the lines of the Western modern ideas, but along what I believe, and somebody disagrees, that's fine, along uninterrupted Indian traditions of both how the Indian economy has been organized for thousands of years, which is why you've seen the rise of the Agarwals in this room, for example, the Banya community or the trading community, which has had so much power, and largesse. And also social conservatism. So India will become a socially conservative and liberally, an economically liberal country over the next 10, 20, 50 years, right? Of course, that means that they will be tailor-made to receive the BJP and the RSS messaging. And that's the reason I believe that the BJP, in my view, is playing the long game, all right? While the Congress is yet to identify an issue on which they can hang their hat, the BJP is creating a platform for which it will have electoral, social, and economic dominance for the next 20, 30, 40 years, right? So that is my point about the arrival of economic reforms. But then what does that mean? I'm trying to blend it together. So what will the next government have to do? Right? The goal of the new government will be to address the aspirations of the new India and to accelerate the date of its arrival. Yeah. Mr. Modi started this in 2014, but for 2019, a new resolve is required. Whatever has happened in the last 5 years was a lot, but it was really creating the structural reform required to undertake the next generation of reforms which are inevitable and which will occur and arrive in the hands of the BJP in the next administration. Right? And they're not going to be tinkering reforms, because if you continue to tinker and if you continue to do what you've always done, then we will always only grow as we have always grown, no more than 6, 7, 7.5%, hitting capacity constraints at 8%. I don't know how many of you remember in 2006-7 when the country grew for like 2 consecutive quarters at 9.5% and 10%. We hit capacity constraints. I I was investing, I've seen 3 of the companies in this room, there were asset prices hit a roof, money became very expensive, the stock market became expensive because there is no supply. The Indian economy was small then, it is small now. Right? My point I'm making is deep reforms are required to take India to double-digit growth for the next 10 and 20 years of the type required so that India can manage and create a country for 1.6 billion people, right? That can go for the next 50 years, right? So what the BJP will intend to undertake, in my view, is economic reform so substantive so as to create this sort of trajectory, right? And who will be the architects of this prosperity? Right? It will not be the government. Mr. Modi said this in 2014. Maybe some of the actions have not been fully consummated, but when he said that the government's business is not to be in business, maybe in the next 5 years we will see evidence of that belief, right? And maybe he will finally pull the government out of business, so that we will not have to have meetings over here with government functionaries, right? Indian entrepreneurs have built multi-billion-dollar companies out of nothing, right? Over the last 10, 20 years. And of course, the last 5 years of microeconomic capacity has shriveled those companies, and many of those companies are in stress. I have friends whose EPC companies are in stress, some in bankruptcy. I used to be on the board of 2 companies, both don't exist anymore. We invested $50 million in one company, we took out 0, right? It's okay, we took a risk, but none of the fault, well, very few of those companies suffered because of a management inefficiency. Right? It is fashionable to claim that Indian promoters take the money, siphon the money, go away. It is not that fault. That is not the problem. We have looked at 100 balance sheets. That is not the problem. That's a separate conversation. We can have that some other time. But what will the BJP do, and what the BJP must do? I don't speak for the party at all. It will be to support the creation of a new generation of entrepreneurs who will lead the solutions to create the economy that must be created. In the creation of this economy, India will go out and seek its position clearly and forcefully, right? Nobody will give India a seat on the table unless it has the capacity to take it, right? Right? Power is never given, it is always taken, right? So, and the recent US-China trade conflict is showing evidence of just that. It is the rise of China at the expense, Trump believes, that through nefarious means perhaps, or by circumventing the regimes. But whatever the reason may be, it is the rise of an economy at the expense of the other, relative decline of the US. And the US is the great nation. It is one of the greatest. History will record the last 100 years of the US as a strange period in global civilizational history, when a nation was built out of nothing but a set of ideas, of people who came together to create a great nation. And that's what the US has done. And now China, and now India. So India will work with its key trading partners with a sense of equality. All 3 countries, US, China, and India, within 10 years, they will be the top 3 countries economically, right? It's a very exclusive club, and India will be privileged to be part of it. And they're all tied together anyways, both from an economic perspective, but also from a national security perspective, because the whole evolving Indo-Pacific security doctrine of the US overlaps and includes all of these 3 countries, right? So I should wrap this up. I just say that, there is an opportunity here, right, for the country to create and to recover what has been a civilizational decline. And as India races towards its own destiny and its new destiny, right, many orthodoxies will be ended. Right? Many things we hold true, we hold correct, will end, will change, and India will engage afresh with its own economy and with the world. That's me.